This last summer, something rather incredible happened. Democrats and Republicans in Congress came together and passed a bill. And not only did they pass the bill, it went through the House of Representatives by a vote of 429 to 3. It passed 429 to 3. Then it went on to the Senate, and they just did a voice vote, a unanimous voice vote. And then it went on to the president, and the president signed the bill. And in this vote, people on the far right, the most conservative Republicans and the most progressive liberal Democrats came together and voted for this bill. Now, how is that possible? It doesn't even seem possible if you watch the news. Well, the reason it happened is because the far left and the far right, the Republicans and the Democrats, they came together to pass a bill to attack a common enemy. An enemy that is hated by both the left and the right. An enemy that is hated in red states and blue states. An enemy that I have to confess that I personally hate. And that enemy is robocalls. The bill they passed was to try to limit the amount of robocalls, to do something to keep our cell phones from ringing over and over with recorded robocalls. And so this bill attempts to do something to cut down on this horrible nuisance of these horribly annoying calls, which makes you wonder, why did the three guys vote against it? I mean, I'm wondering who those three representatives who voted against it. Because every day in this country, 167 million robocalls are made. Every day, 167 million. So that's how you bring the left and the right together. That's how you bring political enemies together. Find a common enemy. Find something or someone that they hate even more. And you might think that's the only way that enemies can come together, is a common enemy. But the Bible tells us about another way. Something else, or rather someone else, who brought enemies together. The Bible tells us about someone who brought enemies together. Not to fight a common enemy, but someone who brought enemies together to transform the world. And of course that someone is Jesus. Jesus brought enemies together for a larger purpose of transforming the world. And I want to talk about those two enemies, those two disciples today. Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon, the zealot. Matthew, the tax collector, Simon, the zealot. Now, we read about Matthew just a moment ago. Matthew, of course, is the one who wrote the book of Matthew, the first gospel that bears his name. And Matthew's job was tax collector. Now, we talked about tax collectors before and how when we say tax collector in this context, in the first century Roman world, it's very different from people who work for the government today for the Internal Revenue Service or the Oklahoma Tax Commission. Now, we may kind of make jokes about the IRS or about taxes, and none of us really enjoy paying taxes or writing a check to the government. But deep down in our country, we realize, one, we tax ourselves, we vote for these things, and without taxes, we wouldn't have schools or roads or military or all kinds of other things that taxes pay for. So we kind of grumble, but we understand that even people who work for the Oklahoma Tax Commission or the Internal Revenue Service, they're just doing their job to help our country be able to do what we need to do. Now, it is totally different in first century Judea. It's very different in first century Rome. It's very different in this way. Remember, Rome is an empire that had conquered the known Western world. Rome went in with soldiers and military and conquered nations and subjugated them. And that's what Rome had done to Judea, to the Jews, to the Jewish people. Rome had conquered the Jews. And because they were the conquerors, they then forced the Jewish people to pay taxes to the Roman government. So if you're a Jew paying taxes, you're paying taxes to Rome to pay the soldiers that are occupying your town as an occupying force. You're paying taxes to pay the soldiers who might have crucified your neighbor. You're paying taxes to allow your oppressors to continue to oppress you. You're paying the occupying enemy. And so to be a tax collector, to be a Jewish tax collector, because the Romans realized that they had to farm this out, and it worked better if they got local people to collect the taxes. So to be a Jewish tax collector, you were seen as a traitor. Not only that, but the Roman system of taxes was tax collectors worked on commission. We have people who work on commission selling cars or, go to Mathis Brothers or wherever, and people are working on commission. But IRS agents don't work on commission, but tax collectors in the first century did, which meant the more taxes they collected, the more they got to keep, which opens up a huge amount of corruption, which made tax collectors often become very wealthy by squeezing the last shekel out of their neighbors. And so tax collectors, a Jewish tax collector, one, is working for the occupying enemy, and two, is becoming rich off of your misery. So almost everyone considered a Jewish tax collector as a traitor, as a collaborator. And that was Matthew. Matthew, the tax collector. Now, the other disciple I want to talk about doesn't get nearly as much mention in the Bible, and that is the one named Simon the Zealot. When we look at the list of the disciples, he is one of the ones listed. There's two Simons. There's Simon Peter, and then there's Simon the Zealot. We don't know that much about him except for that little phrase, the Zealot tells us a lot, tells us plenty. The Zealots were a particular group in Israel, an underground group that was dedicating to overthrowing the Roman government. And the tactics they used were what the Romans would call terrorism. They were revolutionaries. They were patriots to Judea. But as far as the Romans were concerned, they were terrorists. Because here's how the Zealots operated. They would hide in alleyways and wait for a Roman soldier to pass through. And then if the Roman soldier passed through alone, the Zealots would jump him and stab him and kill him and assassinate him. The Zealots were also called the Sicarii. They were called the Sicarii because of these little daggers that they carried with them, called the Sicar. And so the Sicarii were those who carried the dagger. They'd have that dagger hidden in their cloak, and if they happened to see a Roman soldier by himself, isolated, they would attack him and stab him and leave him dead in the alleyway. And that was their way of attacking Rome, to assassinate Roman soldiers. Now, I mentioned these two people, Matthew the tax collector, Simon the Zealot, because these two would be natural enemies. Think about it. Matthew, the collaborator, the traitor who's working for Rome. And Simon the Zealot, the revolutionary, the terrorist who's actively trying to kill Roman soldiers. And Jesus calls both of them. Jesus calls both of them to be part of his 12 disciples. And if you read that list and you know the history of the Zealots and you know the reality of being a tax collector, your natural thought is, how could these two people ever coexist? How did they not kill each other on day one? How could they possibly be in the same group? How could they travel together and sleep in the same room and not think one of them was going to kill the other one? How could they eat together? How could they coexist? Because they were natural enemies, working at cross purposes with each other. How could they work together? Because they found something greater than their differences. They found someone greater than their differences. Now, what do we know about how they came to their own stories? How did Matthew come to be a tax collector? We don't know. We don't know how Matthew ended up as a tax collector. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was for money. We don't really know. We know that Matthew's skill was writing, keeping records, being a bookkeeper. Matthew was meticulous in writing things down. And thank goodness he was, because that's why we have the Gospel of Matthew. Because Matthew wrote down Jesus' teachings. Matthew wrote down Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So thank goodness Matthew had that skill of being a bookkeeper, a chronicler. But he turned that skill to keeping tax records. That's how he made a living. Maybe it was the only way he felt safe. Maybe it was the only way he could feed his family, or we don't really know. Maybe he justified it to himself and said, well, somebody's got to do it. And after all, the Romans give us roads, and the Romans have an aqueduct that brought water into the city, and maybe he justified working for the Romans that way. But deep down, he knew he was hated by all of his fellow Jews. Deep down, he knew that when they spoke his name, they spat on the ground. Deep down, he knew that he was considered by almost everyone to be a traitor to his own people, that he was considered scum. Now, how did Simon come to be a zealot? How did Simon come to hate the Romans so bad that he was willing to risk his own life to assassinate them? We don't know. He was undoubtedly a patriot. He probably hated the way that the Roman soldiers treated the Jewish people, how the Roman soldiers could force any Jew to feed them, how the Roman soldiers could force any Jew to give them lodging for the night, how a Roman soldier could go to any Jew and say, Jew, carry my pack for a mile. And the Jew would be required to carry their pack for a mile. Maybe the Romans had imprisoned one of his friends or family. Maybe the Romans had crucified one of his buddies. But for whatever reason, he had a hatred for the Romans, a hatred that was fueled by this thirst for revenge. So you've got these two men, but both of them are drawn to this preacher from Nazareth, this preacher from Galilee, this man Jesus. Because this man Jesus was different from any man they'd ever met. He preached a message that was different from anything they'd ever heard. He talked about mercy. He talked about compassion. He talked about love. He talked about loving your enemies. He said, if somebody slaps you, turn the other cheek. He said, if a Roman soldier forces you to carry their pack for a mile, carry it for 2, to go the extra mile. He talked about a kingdom of God, not made with revolution, not built with swords or spears or daggers, but a kingdom built on faith and hope and kindness and compassion and justice and righteousness. He talked about the power of faith, and that faith could move mountains, that faith was more powerful than any government. And the way he talked about God, he talked about God as a loving father. Other preachers talked about God as an angry judge, but he talked about God as a loving father. And this man Jesus, he did things that no one had ever seen. He could heal the sick. He healed blind men and lepers and the lame. He cast out demons. And he criticized the religious leadership. He called the religious leaders hypocrites. And he gathered followers, but he didn't gather religious people to be his followers. He didn't call priests and rabbis and scribes and Pharisees to be his followers. He called the common people. He had already called these 4 fishermen, these 2 sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew and John and James. He'd called these 4 fishermen to be his disciples. And now he called them. Matthew, the traitor, Simon, the terrorist, and said, Matthew, leave your tax booth and follow me. Simon, leave behind your dagger and follow me. And Matthew did. Matthew left the tax booth, and Simon got rid of his sikar, his dagger. And they both started following Jesus, and they both started working for something bigger, for someone bigger than their political ideals or their income or their hatred or their own safety. And they even started working with somebody that they would have hated in any other situation. They both left behind a life that was unfulfilling, and they started following Jesus. Because you see, our devotion to Jesus is bigger than anything that might divide us. bigger than our politics, bigger than our generational age differences, bigger than our backgrounds, bigger than our education, bigger than our income, bigger than any of the groups or cliques that we might have fallen into. And you know that happens. It happens early in our lives. It happens middle school or high school, where we fall into groups that start to not associate with other groups. And we start to define people by this group or that group. And we only eat lunch with people who are a part of this group and not that group. And we begin to put up these barriers and walls. I've talked over the last few weeks about several of my friends. One that I've mentioned a few years ago was one of my best pastor friends, Paul. Paul is one of my best pastor friends, and he and I are the same age, graduated from high school the same year. Didn't go to high school together. Both went to OU, but we didn't know each other at OU. And had we known each other at OU, we would have hated each other. Because that's how different we were. Because I, of course, was the studious nerd who liked to listen to Broadway music and collect comic books. And Paul was the athlete, the high school quarterback who was into partying and cocaine. And those two would not mix in high school or college. A studious nerd and an athletic cocaine addict would not be friends. They would be natural adversaries, enemies. Because I had grown up in the church, and as I went through all the various stages and confirmation and youth group and Wesley Foundation and all those things, my commitment to Christ, my understanding of Jesus continued in a gradual climb. Paul came to Christ in one night. Kind of like his namesake, Paul. He had a one night, Jesus knocked him around and gave up his addiction to cocaine, and his life literally turned around in one night at a worship service. And he became a new guy. And he had majored in pharmacy, but he decided to become a pastor instead. And a few years after that, he and I met, and we became close friends. And you might think, well, we have nothing in common. The only thing we had in common was Jesus. And that was enough for us to become close friends. We both became pastors. He's been one of my best friends for over 30 years. But our friendship was based on Jesus. Even though our backgrounds were so unlike, and our things we had done in life and our things we liked to do were so different, we became close friends because our commitment to Jesus was bigger than any of those differences, any of those cliques, any of those interests, any of those things that naturally divide us. But that's what Jesus does. That's what he did with Matthew and Simon the Zealot. And we're told that after he called Matthew to leave the tax collector booth, he went to dinner at Matthew's house. And there were all kinds of people there. And, tax collectors were so hated, the only people that they would associate with was other tax collectors. No one else would be friends with them. No one else would associate with them. So the only other men there were other tax collectors. And we know that the only women who would associate with them were prostitutes. The only women who would have anything to do with tax collectors were prostitutes. So Jesus goes into a dinner full of tax collectors and prostitutes. And the Pharisees, seeing this, say to the disciples of Jesus, how can your rabbi call himself a teacher, a rabbi, a holy man, when he hangs around with people like this? He's eating, he's breaking bread, he's sitting at a table with tax collectors and prostitutes. How can he do that and call himself a man of God, a preacher? How can he do this, associating with these people, eating with these people? And Jesus says, healthy people don't need a doctor. It's sick people who need a doctor. And I've come to heal people who are sick in their soul, sick in their spirit. And then Jesus quotes the Old Testament. He says, you ought to go read Hosea 6:6, which says this, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, Hosea lived about 750 years before Jesus, in the 8th century BC. In the 8th century BC, the temple in Jerusalem was still standing. This is before the Babylonians tore it down. So the magnificent temple that Solomon built was still standing. And people worshiped by bringing their sacrifices to the temple, which meant they would bring their lamb or goat or grain or other kinds of sacrifice, and they'd bring it to the altar. And if it was an animal sacrifice, they'd kill the animal and burn part of the animal on the altar. They would go through the prescribed religious ritual. And people were doing that, and then they were leaving the temple after they made their sacrifice and going out and just living bad lives. Lives oppressing the poor, lives of injustice, lives of lying and corruption, and doing all kinds of other things. They were fulfilling their religious duty in the temple and then living lives that were far from God. And the prophet Hosea said, God, your sacrifices in the temple are not what he really wants. What he really wants is your heart. What he really wants is mercy. He wants you to treat one another with mercy and compassion. He wants you to treat each other with love. He wants you to start helping the widows and the orphans. He wants you to stop oppressing the poor and cheating people and lying. He wants mercy, not sacrifice. And Jesus quotes this verse to the Pharisees and says, these people need God. They're sick. They're sick with sin. But that's why I've come. And Jesus says, I've come not for the righteous, but for sinners. Which the Pharisees thought, well, then he's not for us because we're righteous. We're good people. The message of the Bible is, of course, that none of us can call ourselves good or righteous. That everybody is a sinner. There's only one man who ever lived without sin, and his name was Jesus. All the rest of us sin. Are some sins seemingly bigger or more newsworthy or more harmful than other sins? Well, yes. But we all sin. We all sin in thought and deed. we all sin. And so when Jesus says, I've come for sinners, that's good news. That means he's come for us. Because we all fit the description of sinful people. He's come for us. And he's the doctor for our souls. He's the physician for our spirits. And what good news that is. That Jesus comes for people like us. And even though all of us come from different backgrounds, and all of us may have different things that we like, and different political affiliations, or we've come from different places economically and all kinds of differences. We come here and we sit in the same pews with people that we probably wouldn't associate with anywhere else, because that's what the church is. The church is the place where you come together despite a lot of differences, because we come together because there's someone greater that binds us. And the someone who binds us is the doctor of our souls, the great physician, who Jesus, who's come to call each of us to himself. Let's pray.